When the internet began, bulletin board services, or BBS, became the first online communities of the so-called information superhighway. Using their phone lines, people logged in from all over America to talk about sports, games, movies, and on one BBS in particular, share their ghost stories. Over time, those communities all went dark, except for one lone server that continues to operate somewhere in an unknown part of Pennsylvania's Rust Belt. A relic of the 1990s, veiled in mystery, it is a digital archive of humanity's strangest encounters with the unknown, as told by the people who experienced them. My name is Brandon Schexnayder, and you are listening to Fear Daily.
Subject: A Little Witch Hazel. User: John Doe 99. Posted October 12, 1999.
When Tyler started complaining about the itch on his shoulder, we told him it was just a bug bite. It was the time of year spiders started coming inside, I said, so he probably rolled over on one in his sleep and it had taken exception. A little witch hazel on that, baby, twice a day, and you'll be fine in a week, I said. He came to bowling the next week still poking at that same patch on his shoulder, and I asked if it followed my instructions. He said he had, but in that way boys do when they think you can't tell they're bullshitting. God damn it, Tyler, put some witch hazel on that thing and stop fussing with it. You're gonna get an infection. He nodded vaguely and stood up to take his turn. I watched him pick up the ball, saw how he was trying to keep his left shoulder still so the bite wouldn't rub against his t-shirt, and sighed. He rolled a strike, so I figured it couldn't be all that bad. The following week, there was that awful bombing at the federal building over in Oklahoma City, so Benny, the owner of Bowlaway, decided to cancel that week's league games out of respect. Consequently, it was another 7 days before I saw Tyler again, and he wasn't looking great. He'd never been an outdoorsy guy, so you didn't expect to see him tanned, but that night, he was paler than I'd ever seen him. His shirt was loose and billowy, but when it settled just right, I could see that a lump had grown up on his bitten shoulder. Even if I hadn't seen that, he was so obviously favoring his left side that he couldn't throw the ball hard enough down the lane to knock over one pin, let alone 10. Tyler, I said, what's going on with that shoulder, baby? Have you done anything I've told you to do? He looked at me sheepishly, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. He chuckled, then winced. Nah, I've been busy, but I'm gonna do that. It's been getting worse. I took a sip of my beer and held the can against my mouth to muffle a burp. You want me to take a look? I'm no doctor, but I know my bug bites. He looked both relieved and apprehensive, like he was happy someone wanted to help him, but also concerned at what I might say. I popped up from my side and walked over to him, carefully pulling his shirt away from his back just far enough I could see the bite. Jesus, I said before I could stop myself. What is it? Panic in his voice was hard to ignore, and so was the situation on his shoulder. Is it bad? Like I said, I know bug bites. I grew up half outside looking at bugs and half inside learning about them. While I'm no expert, I'm pretty good at assessing them, and this thing had zoomed past bad without bothering to stop for gas. The part of it sitting above the skin was easily the size of a golf ball and dimpled in a similar way, but instead of white, it was an ugly shade of pus yellow. I couldn't be sure, but it looked as if it was throbbing too, keeping time with his heartbeat. Not to brag, but I have a stronger stomach than almost anyone I've ever met, and this was hands down the most upsetting thing I've ever seen. He was sweating, which made the dimples glisten when the overheads of the bowling alley hit them and exposed a tiny black dot in the center of each one. I didn't want to get any closer than necessary, but as I was about to pull back, I caught a whiff of something. Dipping just a few inches closer to Tyler's shoulder, I took another sniff, and sure enough, it was coming from the bite. It smelled like rotting meat. I recoiled, putting several feet between me and my friend. "Tyler, you need to see a doctor." He started stuttering, trying to form an objection. But you said a little witch hazel would do the trick." "That was before, man. Whatever that is, witch hazel can't fix it. You need to have it checked out and lanced. You're probably going to need antibiotics, too." "Jesus, dude, what bit you?" "I don't know," he said in a desperate whine. "Well, whatever it was, get that checked out. Maybe even go to the ER tonight. If you leave that thing any longer, it could go septic, and then you're really going to be in trouble. Will you do that, please?" He said he would, then excused himself from the game. The last time I saw him, he was walking out the door of Bowlaway, headed to his car. Tyler didn't come to the next game or the one after that. No one seemed to know what had happened to him, and there wasn't any real consensus on the last time they'd spoken to him. Tyler had been part of the friend group for longer than I had, but he hadn't really matured alongside everyone, and they weren't exactly upset when he didn't come to things. The motto seemed to be, if Tyler doesn't call you, don't call him. He wasn't my favorite person, but I felt bad no one had bothered to check up on him. I couldn't stop thinking about that bite and the ugly way it had pulsed. Bile rose up in my throat. "Guys," I said at the conclusion of the next frame, "it's kind of fucked up that no one has talked to him. I know he sucks, but what if that infection on his shoulder has gotten worse? We should at least stop by before we go to the bar." The group grumbled and groused, but in the end they agreed, and after the second game we drove over to Tyler's place. We never got those beers. Tyler lived in a little A-frame house that his grandparents had left him. It was on a double lot on a quiet side street, set far enough apart from his neighbors that his stereo system couldn't annoy anyone too much. As we pulled up to the curb, I saw that the lights in Tyler's front room were on, which seemed like a good sign. Opening the car door, I listened for the telltale signs of him being home. Usually a movie rental or Allman Brothers album playing at top volume, but it was dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop. It was dark, but Tyler's lawn looked shaggy and unkempt, as if he hadn't cut it in weeks. He wasn't exactly fastidious about these things, but this was a new level even for him. Closer to the house, the interior lights cast wan pools on the nearest parts of the lawn, and I saw that it wasn't just unkempt, but there was a fine fuzz over top of it, like mold on an old tub of yogurt. It seemed to be radiating out from the house, extending halfway into the glow. One of the others saw the mold-like fuzz and tapped out, saying they would wait for us back at the car. They were the smartest person there. Tyler's front door was locked, so I called his name. No response. The others did the same, all their voices together loud enough to wake, if not the dead, at least his neighbors. Still, nothing. I tried banging on the door, and that's when it went bad. Instead of colliding with the hard wood, my fist met a soggy mass with the texture of wet bread and went right through it. Never in my life had I made a sound like I did then, a mixture of surprise and disgust. Worse, when my hand was through the door, I felt something skitter across it in the dark on the other side. I ripped my arm back and checked my hand to confirm there were no cuts or bites. The whole thing raised a clamor among the friends still left at the door, and we were trying to process it when one of them screamed. Something was crawling across the inside of the window, casting a massive shadow onto the fuzzy lawn. It looked vaguely spider-like, but not similar to any spider I could think of, at least not one native to our state. The first spider was joined by a second, then a third, fourth, and fifth. We all screamed like hell and ran back to the car, peeling out there with a screech. After several minutes of panic-filled babbling, we calmed down enough for one of the others to suggest we go to the police. Whatever was happening to Tyler was bigger than we could handle. In fact, we never found out exactly what it was that happened. Police officers who performed the welfare check in response to our report wouldn't get any closer to the house than halfway down the sidewalk. From what I heard, the moldy overgrowth of the lawn had spread even further, and beneath it, things could be heard moving in the grass. In the end, it was a biohazard team from the city that had to go into Tyler's place. You won't read this in the papers, but that county biohazard team also was responsible for razing the house to the ground. My cousin Andy works for the fire service, and he told me that they were informed a controlled urban burn would be happening and advised the department not to interfere. Bowling took a back seat for a few weeks as we all tried to process what had happened. The state team had not only burned Tyler's house to the ground, but had taken all the materials with them, along with the first 3 feet of topsoil. 2 years later, and that property is still sitting vacant, like a socket missing its tooth. You know what haunts me most about all this? We never really found out exactly what happened to our friend. We knew he was dead, but not how. And all the police would tell us was that his remains were found in the bathroom, right next to a broken hand mirror and a bottle of witch hazel.
Subject: the wreck of the Santa Maria. User: F. Respondanon. Posted May 2nd, 1996.
There's no way to know who saw the bodies first. Some people say it was bass fishermen out on Penobscot Bay who thought they'd landed the catch of the day, but instead pulled in the waterlogged remains of a middle-aged man. Others say it was retirees in a walkers group strolling out to Rockland Lighthouse, their morning exercise interrupted by a mass of tide-driven corpses surging against the breakwater. Some even say the dead simply appeared in the middle of the town square that day, right in front of a group of third graders on their way to tour City Hall. It's been almost 20 years now, so for anyone who wasn't there when the survivors of the Santa Maria washed up in Rockland, Maine, the legends, whichever you believe, have far outpaced the truth. The hell of the thing is, I was there on that day in 1972, and the truth is far stranger than any of the stories people tell about it. It started as a normal day. I was in the Coast Guard at the time, stationed in Rockland. CWO was Larry Everman, as good a man as I ever served under. Larry knew everyone in and around the station, their names, what they did, and made sure to ask about their lives. When he retired in '85, he took a lot of that station's heart with him. In '72, though, Larry was still running things when the call came in from Dave Bennett over at Owl's Head Lighthouse. His voice, usually relaxed and deep, had a tightness I'd never heard. Dave said that he'd been at the waterline walking the family wolfhound when he'd seen something nightmarish washed up on the rocky shore, 4 bodies, 2 of them children. He'd attempted resuscitation, he said, but they were beyond help. Bodies washing ashore means a wreck, so after notifying Rockland PD of the bodies at Owl's Head, we put some calls on the radio to other nearby stations. None of the other units had unresolved maydays, and the sea had been like glass for the last 2 weeks, so we drew a blank across the board. Our only real option was to start examining tide tables to determine how far these people could have drifted, and from there take a swing at where their boat had gone. The next call to come in over the radio was from Cheryl Baker, who worked on the harbor at the North Haven ferry dock. Her voice was barely audible through crackling distortion. "Hap, it's Cheryl. We need someone down here at the dock, like right now." More bodies, I thought. Had to be. Where was this goddamn boat? I grabbed the mic. "Cheryl, if what I think is happening, we know. Owl's Head has already called it in. Better to keep it off an open channel." More static. I thought she was gone, but then I could hear her voice as if she was holding the mic away from her mouth. Sir, it's going to be okay. Help is on the way." She came back to the microphone. "Hap, I don't know how Owl's Head could possibly see these people from out here, but if you know, why haven't you already sent someone?" A shiver ran through me. "Cheryl, are you saying there are survivors? Survivors? Maybe. Hap, all I know is I've got people here who need help. You need to send someone now." When I spoke to Cheryl later, she said she'd heard the voice of a small child calling for help and followed the sound down to the waterline. There, she'd seen a group of men, women, and children amongst the dock pilings, some of them gasping for breath, some hunched over sobbing, and others not moving at all. In total, there were 26 people who came out of the water that day. They ranged in age from toddler to late 50s, and after being evaluated by doctors at Knox General, were found to generally be in good health, aside from shock and grief. Parents had lost children. Children had lost parents, and every other variation in between. We didn't have a complete count of the dead by the time the survivors were seen to, but in the end, we located 37 bodies in and around Penobscot Bay, bringing the total number of people involved to 63. If any of this had been allowed to become part of the historical record, it would have been the biggest maritime disaster in our bay since the burning of the PSS Royal Tar in 1836, when 32 people lost their lives. Things began to unravel during the interviews. Larry sent me and Terry Anderson over to Knox General to help Chief Chris organize the survivors. In the meantime, multiple boats had been sent into the Penobscot to scour for the ship that these poor people had wrecked from. A ship that, according to each interview I sat in on, was a passenger ferry called the Santa Maria. The problem with that was that no such ferry existed in the main state ferry service, nor was there any boat with a name even remotely close. To make it even stranger, the ferry survivors claimed to have been en route to Rockland from an island in the Gulf called San Germain. When we showed them a map of the coast, every single adult pointed to either North Haven or Vinyl Haven, but claimed they were a single piece of land connected by Ajax bridges. That last part was said in a way that suggested the function of such a thing was obvious, and they were puzzled when we asked what it meant. As best as I could piece together, it's some kind of floating bridge, but when one of the survivors, a man who called himself Timothy Flight, claimed to be a civil engineer on San Germain and tried to describe how the technology works, his explanation quickly moved out of our realm of understanding. The agreed-upon explanation as to how the Santa Maria's passengers ended up in the water was an electrical storm, far in excess of what their weathermen had predicted. Timothy explained that their weather station could track cloud patterns for more than 100 miles, but this had seemingly come out of nowhere, a maelstrom of purple lightning and howling winds. The sea had been whipped up into swells that dwarfed the small passenger ferry before finally capsizing it halfway between Saint-Germain and the mainland. He said that the final wave had come so quickly they hadn't had time to cast for help. That was his word, cast, and so when the boat flipped with a roar of steel and water, he thought they were going to die out there. Not a single one of the surviving passengers remembered the storm passing or how they ended up on the rocks underneath the dock. They remembered hitting the water, then the next thing they knew, they were leaning against wooden pilings in the shade, throwing up seawater. By late afternoon, a massive search and rescue operation had completely failed to recover a single sign of any boat called the Santa Maria, swamped or otherwise, and that's when the government boys took over. No one, not Larry, not Chief Chris, not any of the search and rescue personnel, knew who had called these jokers, but their suits and sunglasses were undeniably of the federal variety. Outside, I saw a line of black vans that I assumed were for the survivors, an assumption I'd verified when one of the feds, who introduced himself as Marbach, said that they were taking custody of the passengers. We tried to fight them. Not only were these people clearly traumatized, but something very strange was going on, and we were going to need them to sort it out. Not to mention the morgue and frozen reefers full of bodies they would have to help us identify. Marbach didn't argue. He just said that the decision was out of his hands and that the government was taking custody of everything related to the Santa Maria, including any paperwork we had so far created on the wreck. I was fuming. The feds don't give a rat's ass about Maine any other time, but now they wanted to push us around? Larry tried rattling cages higher up in the guard chain of command, but we got a one-word reply: cooperate. Watching that lineup of scared people being herded into those vans was one of the worst moments of my life. Wherever they were going, I knew one thing for sure. There wasn't going to be any understanding or mercy shown to them. They represented something Uncle Sam didn't want anyone else to know, and that meant they were no longer people. They were assets. As I watched the line of black vans pull away from the hospital, guilt at my inability to help these people sat heavily in my stomach. A moment later, the first van cut a hard right, slamming into the curb fast enough for one of the tires to jump it. The others swerved behind it, careening left and right as they tried not to slam into one another. Brakes squealed, tires leaving black rubber smears on the asphalt as one by one the vans ground to a halt. The suited G-men got out of the van, the bewilderment of their faces obvious despite their sunglasses. The back of each van was torn open, and then the reason for their shock was obvious to all of us. The survivors of the Santa Maria, every single man, woman, and child, were gone. The feds took all of our paperwork as promised, but there was nothing else for them to bring back to whatever godforsaken office they'd come from. In addition to every single living Santa Maria passenger vanishing into thin air, the bodies of the dead had done exactly the same, taking with them their clothing, personal items, anything that might have started its day on the ferry that didn't exist. Over the years, I've talked to some of the other people who worked with the survivors that day and learned a few more things. Some of the adults commented on how sour the air was and developed minor coughs. The children were apparently unusually intelligent, able to understand the questions asked by doctors without needing to have anything explained to them. Conversely, however, they were baffled by references made to popular children's shows, books, or movies. A nurse told me that one of the children had even asked what a movie was. As I said before, the legend of the Santa Maria has long outpaced the truth of what happened that day. Depending on who you ask, the passengers were either abducted by aliens or were aliens themselves, or even stupider things I won't dignify by listing them here. Mind you, even though I grit my teeth when people say those things, maybe they're right in a different way. I have no way to explain any of the events we experience, so maybe an allegorical explanation is better. Maybe those people were aliens from another world, just one that we also happen to occupy as well.
Fear Daily is an independent podcast hosted by Brandon Schexnayder and written by Brennan Storr, with Joanna Smith serving as the consulting editor, audio production by Rachel Boyd, and sound design by Southern Gothic Media. This podcast is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to real events or locations, is entirely coincidental. Ad-free versions of Fear Daily are available now on your favorite podcast apps. For more information, visit feardaily.com. But move fast, before the server goes offline.